Welcome back, welcome back. I'm so excited to be here with you today because today we are going to be talking about my favorite of the 5 rules of receiving, and that is the rule of receiving yourself. But before we dive in, I did want to talk a little bit about what we did in training number 1, just a quick review, just so we're both grounded in the same place. Now, what I promise you is that by the end of this training today, you are going to walk away with an exercise that is going to shift things radically for you. And you are going to be so surprised at how easy it is. But for now, let's jump in and review what we covered in our first training. In our first training, we learned that a lot of the manifestation work out there talks about asking and receiving, but the missing step in manifestation work like that is that we must release resistance if we're going to receive. You also learned how this resistance creates a field around you that blocks the gifts the universe is sending you. We covered that manifestation tools like vision boards, visualization, and such are great, but only really work if you release resistance, and that you don't even need to do any of those things to ask the divine for help. Simply holding that desire within you is enough to get the divine to help you because the divine loves you. And as we jump in, I just want to remind you that if the word divine doesn't work for you, the universe, you use whatever word makes the most sense to you, and just know we're all talking about that source of love and light that birthed us into the world. You learned what resistance feels like in your body, and we asked the divine to lift that resistance from you. And I would suspect that things have already started working for you just by that one exercise. And finally, I encourage you to start tracking the magic that shows up. Remember, we talked about Pearson's Law. What we track expands, what we track and report on expands exponentially. So, what has shifted for you since our last training? One of the greatest tools we have to anchor what we're learning is to stop and write and keep track of what's shifted, what's changed. Because here's what happens when you do. That gets your brain on board to learn more. It gets your brain to understand that something good is happening here, that progress is being made, and progress helps us feel successful. Successful feelings help the brain release resistance. When we last left off in training number 1, we learned that when we were born, the universe, the divine source, had agreed to respond to any requests, any desires we had, and support us on our path if it was for our highest good. And yet we were taught to create resistance, a field of resistance around us by the people who raised us and our peers and society in general. So the big question is, how do we start to dissipate that resistance? How do we start to dissolve this resistance and get back into a natural giving and receiving relationship with the universe, with the divine? If we're going to figure out how to release all this resistance, we have to understand where it's coming from. And as I mentioned, my favorite rule of receiving is to receive ourselves. And the reason is twofold. First is, the biggest culprit in creating resistance in our energy field is when we resist ourselves. So that's number 1. Number 2 is, out of all of the rules of receiving ourselves is the 80-20 home run. What I mean by that is 80% of our challenges with resistance are solved with 1/5 of the solution, the 20%, which is to receive ourselves. And the reason is that it takes the least amount of work, but it has the biggest impact. Now, you may be surprised to learn that this idea of us resisting ourselves isn't new. In fact, the rejected self theory is a well-known, well-understood theory in the psychological community. It dates back as early as 1907. So while I was getting my master's in psychology, both of my children were toddlers. And here is what I can promise you. A parent can go into parenting wanting the best for her children, their children. And that was me, right? And I was studying all of this stuff and I wanted to raise my children to self-actualize, right? So you'd think I could hit this one out of the park. Well, let me tell you something. Toddlers are horrible, horrible human beings about 50% of the time. I know that seems cruel of me to say, but think about it. Toddlers throw food and they scream and they drop down in the middle of shopping malls and go limp and refuse to leave. And as a parent, as a loving parent, the idea that I would raise my children to think that this was acceptable, it just scared me. Because as much as I wanted my children to self-actualize, to have the most expanded version of their own lives, I also wanted them to be socially acceptable. That didn't mean I wanted everyone to approve of them, but I wanted them to be able to leave my home one day and get a job and have friends and hopefully romantic partnerships. And when I compared their behaviors to those dreams of what I wanted for them, they didn't make sense. And it was really hard for me to just accept and affirm all their behaviors. And so I can tell you that even the best intended parents, when we're really at a place where what we want for our children is, their highest version of their life, but we first of all want to make sure that they can get a job and take care of themselves, that's the lower level of safety and security, and we're always going to go there. For all my tools and all of my trainings, I went there myself. Now, as they've developed, I've tried to help them accept their behaviors, but I can tell you, even me who had all these tools got it wrong. I mean, look at them. How dang cute are they? But what I can promise you is that even the most loving, conscious parent can get this wrong. And beyond that, we will pass down our unhealed stuff. And it doesn't matter whether these are our children that we're raising or nieces or nephews or cousins. We have an energetic relationship to our family line, and any unhealed stuff we have will get transmitted to future generations. But here's the cool side of that. Any healing we do on ourselves will get passed down to future generations as well. And that, to me, is the big win here in the work we're doing here. So as we go through the rest of this training, as you're listening, understand you're not just doing this for yourself. You're doing this for all future generations in your family. Because even if you don't have a direct relationship to a child in your family, in terms of like raising them or being with them all the time, this does transmit to generations going forward. So if you need a really good reason to do it, and it's not just doing it for yourself, do it for the future generations, because as we heal our families exponentially. And as that exponential healing happens, it starts to shift the world. You may be wondering, how does this work? How does this actually come into play when we're growing up as children? And so I want to talk you through it in really simple terms. If you focused on asking for what you wanted or taking care of yourself, maybe you just need to chill out after school. Most likely you got some form of disapproval from the adults around you. When you gave to others or focused on sharing or giving or working hard, even when you were tired, most likely you got some kind of approval from the adults around you. So, as you saw behaviors that grown-ups liked, you equated those to parts that you wanted to keep. And as you engaged in behaviors that grown-ups didn't like, you equated those to the parts of yourself that you didn't want to keep, that you wanted to get rid of. This is what began this cycle of self-rejection. And it's this kind of rejection that blocks out all other forms of abundance, love, and support. So as adults, as we're walking around inside this cycle of self-rejection, what's happening is you're using energy in your body to push parts of yourself away. You're literally doing this with your energy. And this is what creates that energetic field, or fills the energetic field around you with resistance. Because if you want to rest, and resting isn't good, that makes you lazy, you're going to push away resting. Now for you, that might look like, oh, I'll rest once I get to X, Y, and Z point. And we do it in lots of different ways. And what happens is not just that we are using up energy to do this, not just that we're blocking abundance and intuitive connection, but there's no way for us to connect to our natural innate wisdom if we're not whole. If we've got parts of ourselves that we're pushing off to the side, we won't have access to the wholeness that grows our intuitive gifts. So if you've ever wanted to, talk to your loved ones that have passed away, or just know what the right thing is to do, or to see signs or read oracle cards, any of those gifts, those need to come from wholeness. So as long as there's pieces of yourself that you're pushing away, you won't have the wholeness to have that intuitive connection. On top of it, the different parts of you that you've pushed away come with wisdom. The lazy part knows how to rest properly. So if you've ever tried to rest, but always felt kind of fidgety, and it's because you're guilty and you just can't quite get yourself to rest properly. It's because, and by the way, and you're frustrated with that, like you've finally given yourself, time in front of the television or to go for a walk or whatever, but your mind's not slowing down. It's because the part of you that could actually do that resting is shoved away, is locked away in a closet. So now our work is to invite in those parts so that we can return to that wholeness. And what's so cool is that wholeness, it helps you invite in miracles you forgot you asked for, things you didn't even know were possible, dreams come true that you haven't even imagined. And I'll give you 2 exciting examples of this phenomenon, people that I would guess you know. The first person is Brené Brown. Now, if you are familiar with Brené Brown, you know she talks about vulnerability, about the gifts of imperfection. But if you look at the trajectory of her career and you look at the trajectory of her own personal abundance coming into her life, you will see that when she took the stage and started to talk about the parts of herself that she never liked, the parts of herself that she was super uncomfortable with, that is when her career, that is when her fame and her fortune really took off. Not just that, that's when her impact took off. All the lives she has impacted come back to the moment she decided to accept the parts of herself she had been rejecting. And Brené is not the only example of this. There's a hero in my life because she inspires me and my children, and that is Amanda Gorman. She's a poet laureate here in the States, the youngest poet laureate. And I immediately became fascinated with her when she took the stage at President Biden's inauguration. There was just something commanding in her presence. As I started to look into what her story was, it fascinated to me to find out that she actually had a speech impediment, and that speech impediment, she decided not to just say, okay, well, I've got this speech impediment, so I can't be successful, or I can't be fill in the blank. She used that speech impediment. She invited that in as part of herself. And that was how she learned to work with language in a way that makes her such a powerful poet. And look at the impact she's having. And now, if you're not familiar with her and she hasn't impacted you, I highly recommend you check her out. But here's what I can tell you is I interact with a lot of young people, just from being a mom, but talking to my kids' friends and relatives. And I can tell you she has a tremendous impact on the young people in our country, not just in what she's saying, but what she's showing them is possible. That would not have happened if she wasn't so accepting of herself. As you start to invite back in the parts of yourself you've rejected, oh my goodness, things are going to get exciting. It is just amazing what can happen as we bring back in the parts of ourselves that we've left on the sidelines for so long. And you will start to realize dreams again you didn't even know you had, or maybe you did have, but you've long since lost them. So get excited. Now, the one thing I do want to tell you is that you haven't just rejected one part of yourself. You've likely rejected lots of little parts of yourself. And it's really important that you only work with one rejected self at a time. Now, as you start to do this work, and I'm going to give you an exercise that's going to let you invite back in a rejected self, what's going to happen is things are going to shift. Things are going to change. First, it's going to start energetically, but then in your world, you're going to start to see magic arriving. And your instinct is going to be to start to bring in lots of different rejected selves. And I know this because I've been teaching this in the receiving school for over 2 years now. And over and over again, we have to rein our members back in and say, like, I know you're excited about what's happening here, but we really just want to stay with one rejected self and integrate her, him, they, and really start to work with that. Because trust me, integrating just one rejected self is going to make a huge difference. And you really do want to do it slowly, because remember, the reason you rejected these parts is because you believe these parts of yourself were unsafe, that they made you not acceptable to the people that loved you. And so as you invite them in, it is going to bring up some stuff. So you want to do it slowly. So the two rejected selves that I want to introduce you to are ones that I find almost every person carries. Now, what I'm saying is that you might have a rejected self that is just unique to you, that you rejected the painter, or you rejected the smart person, or you rejected the builder or the engineer, right? That might be unique to your particular journey. Maybe you were like that as a kid, but you learned that the people in your family were X, Y, and Z. But there are two selves that I find most people reject. And the first one is the lazy self, and the second one is the irresponsible self. Now, as I said those words, most likely you were like, yeah, I don't want to be lazy. Yeah, I don't want to be irresponsible. And on the surface, that makes sense, right? Lazy isn't good. Irresponsible isn't good. The challenge is that we have put those labels across a lot of behaviors. So lazy in its most extreme sense is doing nothing at all ever, right? Like doing nothing to bring your dreams to life. But most likely, you've also labeled resting as lazy, lots of things as lazy. Same thing with irresponsible. And if you're wondering whether these selves are part of your rejected self wardrobe, I would say, let me ask you this. Have you ever thought, oh, it's so hard. Why does it have to be so hard? Or, gosh, I don't even know if I have fun anymore. I don't know if I know how to have fun. Or I'm overwhelmed a lot. Or I feel exhausted a lot of the time. If you have said any of those things, I'm telling you, either one or both of these rejected selves are at play, meaning you have pushed these parts of yourself out of you, and it's their wisdom that's going to get you back to a place where you feel well rested, where you feel in balance, where things feel easier.